I was thinking to myself about what is family, and this is obviously the theme, part of the theme of this conference, but it's also been the theme for the whole year for WIA in relation to the UN theme of the year on family, and so our International Solidarity Forum in the spring was on the family, which Brad also spoke at. And so in asking about what's family, I think what became obvious is that for many of us, family is really that foundation that we take for granted. For those who've been lucky to be born into a stable, supportive home, it's sort of that thing that we don't even question because it's just there for us. And it's that ability and that to see that strength of sort of who we are in light of what we've been given, of that support, of that community, of that network, that I think is really part of Dr. Wilcox's work, is to sort of call our attention to what we have and what we really need to therefore pass on and affirm and work towards building and strengthening. And so as I was presenting this year's theme to a group of high school students here in New York, I had my flyer out and I was sort of selling it, it's going to be this great conference, lots of young people coming, and you guys should attend. And so I thought that the ideas of manhood and masculinity might not be the sort of relevant selling point for 13-year-olds. And instead, I sort of took the perspective of promoting what I thought would be a more tangible aspect of the conference, and that is the importance of fatherhood. Sort of saying we all have, we all know how important that is, how fathers are important in our life. And to my very naive surprise came a series of eye rolls and then a chorus of outcries, things like, fathers aren't that important and I don't need a dad. And that's when the reality of my own privilege really struck me. They didn't know that person who, at the very least, by the sheer fact of co-creation, had a stake in being a part of their life. I was speaking to a room full of kids who had grown up without a father. So I think in light of that, looking at family, looking also in particular at fatherhood. So is fatherhood important? What does fatherhood have to do with being a man, if anything? We'll be looking at that this weekend. And then what does fatherhood have to do with building a free and just society? So in all the ways that we try and work to promote social justice or economic equality or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what do all of those ideas have to do with this sort of very foundational idea of family and who leads that family? So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brad Wilcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia and a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. Previously, he served as a fellow at Princeton University and Yale University. His work on marriage, child well-being, fatherhood, and cohabitation is regularly featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Slate, and other media outlets. Professor Wilcox blogs, and I highly recommend that you check it out. The link is in your brochure. And also follow him on Twitter at WilcoxNMP. So without further ado, I want to thank Brad for being here. You're welcome.
Well, let me start with some thank yous, if I can navigate this PowerPoint here. There we go. Thanks to Claire and to the World Youth Alliance for having me here tonight. I'd also like to thank some co-laborers in the scholarly arena. Kathleen Kovner-Klein at UPenn has helped me on a new book that we just came out with last year called Gender and Parenthood. And then Robert Lerman as well at the Urban Institute has a new report with me called For Richer, for Poorer that I'll be talking about tonight. So from Hollywood to the halls of academe, we often hear the message that fathers and marriage do not matter. Children, we're told, need not enjoy the shelter and security of a fathered home to thrive. For instance, after starring in The Switch, a movie about a woman who has a child with a sperm donor, Jennifer Aniston announced, quote, "Women are realizing it more and more when they don't have to settle with a man just to have that child." Or from the halls of academe, we can take Cornell psychologist Peggy Drexler. In her book on Maverick Moms, which celebrates women raising boys without men, Drexler claims that, quote, "women possess the innate mom power, that in itself is more than sufficient to raise fine sons. Likewise, psychologists Louise Silverstein and Carl Auerbach minimize the importance of fathers in marriage in their article, Deconstructing the Essential Father, which appeared to much fanfare in the American Psychologist. This message that fathers in marriage are not important has not been lost in today's young adults. In fact, a large minority of millennials believe, as we can see here in the next slide, In fact, a large minority of millennials believe that marriage is becoming obsolete and that the growing variety of family forms is a good thing, according to this recent Pew report featured right up here. It's all of a piece with a more laissez-faire or libertarian view of family life that many young adults today find compelling. There's only one problem with this new conventional wisdom, and that's that it's not true. That's the only problem, okay? Because the science tells us that good fathers are transformed by the experience of fatherhood, that good fathers play a distinct and transformative role in the lives of their kids, and that good fathers are most likely to be found in intact and married families. Now, when you make these kinds of claims, it's important to begin with this kind of caveat. And that is that we know that both moms and dads can and often do make similar contributions to the lives of their kids. We also know, too, that single parents, single mothers, and single fathers can often make up for the absence of one sex in the lives of a child. I was raised by a single mom, and she gave me lots of authoritative discipline over the years growing up in our family. But what I want to suggest to you today, is that on average, both men experience parenthood differently than do women, and also have a unique impact on the lives of their children. So let's begin by thinking about the ways in which fatherhood transforms men. Now, the first thing I want to say is that we all know that motherhood, becoming a mother, is transformative for women in very obvious ways. But we're finding out more and more ways in which men are also transformed by becoming dads. We know, for instance, that men put on some pounds when their wives are pregnant. My wife's been pregnant a couple of times in the last couple of years, which might account for the fact that I'm a little bit larger than I used to be, say, 5 or 6 years ago. But more importantly and more seriously, we also know that there's some other physiological changes that happen in men. We know, for instance, from research from men in the United States, in China, and in the Philippines, that men's testosterone levels tend to come down in the wake of becoming fathers. So we can see, for instance, in a new study from the Philippines, that men who are both newly partnered and new fathers showed the largest declines in testosterone. This next slide here gives you a sense of what that looks like in reality. Looking at changes from time 1 to time 2, and what you can see here on this slide is that guys who were newly partnered saw a decline in their testosterone, and the guys who were both newly partnered and then newly fathered, or becoming fathers, saw the biggest declines in their testosterone levels. So it suggests there's a physiological effect of being in proximity to one mate for guys, and then being in proximity to one's offspring. And this particular finding is actually consistent with what we see in some mammals as well. So it suggests there really is something physiological happening here. And it's, of course, significant in part because testosterone is associated both with aggression and with heightened libido. So what this research suggests to us, perhaps, is that, as psychologist Annie Story has written, quote, that hormones may play a role in priming males to provide care for the young. So the fact that men's testosterone is coming down as they're in a regular, in a sense, romantic relationship, usually marriage in the Philippines, for instance, and the fact that they're in close connection to their offspring seems to play a role in kind of settling them down physiologically. And of course, the institutions of marriage and fatherhood, as they're articulated in most societies, reinforce that kind of settling down effect. What's also interesting, though, about this research is the dads who were the most involved with their kids, had the biggest declines in testosterone. So what this suggests is a kind of feedback effect where affiliative pair bonding and paternal care may play an important increased role in domesticating men and orienting towards their families when they're investing in their kids and spending time with them. So that's just a quick sense of how biology plays a role when it comes to transforming men in the wake of becoming engaged and active dads. But it's also the case that there are important social and economic outcomes. We know, for instance, that dads who live with their kids are more likely to attend bars less often and church more often in the wake of having their kids here in the U.S. They're also more likely to be doing well psychologically. Young adult men, ages 24 to 34, are more depressed if they've had kids but are living apart from them, or if they don't have kids. So once again, living with your kids, and it can certainly be stressful, as I can attest personally, has its challenges, obviously, but it is linked, for instance, on this important outcome to lower levels of depression. And then when it comes to the economy, it's very clear that the process of becoming a father has important implications for the way in which men orient themselves to the world of work. Men who are fathers tend to work harder, work more strategically, and make more money. But it's important to note in all this kind of fatherhood premium is limited to married dads. Indeed, once again, dads who don't live with their kids actually experience an income penalty. So it's a process of being and living within a family where there's a sense of responsibility for your kids and a sense of connection to those kids that's linked to a premium today for men who are once again married to the mother of their children. And indeed, the premium here, when it comes to this marriage and fatherhood effect, is in the order of 10 to 18%, depending upon the kind of studies that you're looking at. Now here I want to give you just a quick sense of some new work that I did with Robert Lerman at the Urban Institute. And we're looking here at marriage in particular. But these effects will actually be somewhat more augmented for men who are married fathers. But it gives you a sense of the way in which marriage plays an important role, family life plays an important role in affecting men's position in the economy. And what you can see here basically is that for young adult men, ages 28 to 30, they make about $15,000 more than their peers who are single, but otherwise pretty similar in terms of their education, their race, their ethnicity, and a number of other factors that we account for here at the bottom of this slide. And that when they reach their mid-40s, they make about $18,000 more than do their roughly equivalent single peers. So a pretty big, in this case, marriage premium for both young adult men and for middle-aged men here in the U.S. But is this finding, is it just a correlational finding, or is it causal? And there are a couple of reasons to think that this may be a causal finding. In other words, at least some portion of this premium can be attributed to the unique effects that marriage has upon men. So we know that men are more likely to really engage in the labor force after they get married. We know that they're more likely to take on difficult work and to be concerned about their pay when they're married. We also know that they actually work more hours as they get engaged and then after they get married compared to when they were just single. And they also make more strategic choices about their employment when they're married. So this gives you kind of a sense of the trends in terms of the connection to the labor force here in the United States since 1979. You can see the top line, the gold line, is representing married dads in the workforce. And clearly they are more closely connected to employment than their peers who are just married but have no kids, or compared to their peers at the bottom here who are not married and don't have kids. Now, when you present a graph like this, it's obviously the case that it could be the fact that the kinds of guys who are employed in good jobs are more likely to get married and have kids. So this may not be kind of causal just on its own, but it's interesting to kind of just illustrate the close connection here between marriage, fatherhood, and work for men here in the U.S. But when we look at this kind of pattern in a multivariate environment, and we control for, once again, a variety of factors that might affect men's workforce participation, things like their age, things like their race and ethnicity, things like their education, their mother's education, their scores on an AFQT test, which is sort of tapping intelligence and knowledge, we still find that net of those factors, young men are working more hours, and middle-aged men are working more hours compared to their single peers, 400 hours more per year than their single peers. So that gives us some evidence to suggest that, in fact, marriage might be having a causal impact on men's engagement with the contemporary labor force. A second piece of evidence that suggests that there's a kind of a causal story going on here is that married men handle job transitions arguably in a more strategic or a more prudent fashion than do their single peers. So guys who are married and are unhappy with their jobs are much more likely to find a new job before they take their existing job and leave that job. By contrast, guys who are single are more likely to take their job and just leave it without having, first located a second job to transition to. So it gives you a sense of how marriage may affect men's mindset and their approach to work in ways that allow them to maintain a connection to the labor force and a steady stream of income. But what about unobserved factors? Things like motivation, just intrinsic motivation, looks, a sense of humor, or something else that might account for a link between work and marriage. The kinds of things that I've just talked about are not controlling for these kinds of factors in terms of appearance or in terms of personality or potentially even character. So to address that limitation, two scholars, Antonovics and Town, looked at twins in Minnesota. And what they found is that the twins who were married tended to work more and earn more compared to their twins who were not married. So it gives us a little bit more evidence that this is probably, once again, causal, that there's something about the nature of marriage that makes men engage work in a more serious, and fatherhood in a more serious way. So one other piece of evidence here that I think is worth just surfacing is it seems like basically men are most motivated to provide financially for their families even today when they are married to the mother of their kids. And some new research done by Alexandra Killewald at Harvard in sociology finds that this premium associated with marriage and fatherhood is there, but it's not there for unmarried residential dads, non-residential fathers, and stepfathers. So something about being in an intact marriage is driving this fatherhood premium that we're seeing in the research. So just to wrap up this discussion of kind of the connection between fatherhood and economic welfare for men, what I would want to suggest to you tonight is it's about kind of location, location, and location. And the biological, sociological, psychological, economic evidence that I've given to you tonight suggests that fatherhood is most likely to work its transformative magic on men when they live with their kids and with the mother of their kids, normally in the married state. Okay, so we've been considering the ways in which fatherhood is transformative for men. And I want to turn now to think about some ways in which men as fathers exercise a transformative role, a distinct role, on the lives of their kids. And what the evidence suggests to us, and this is from Ross Park, who is one of the preeminent scholars of American fatherhood from psychology, the evidence, as he has written, is telling us that there are differing styles of maternal and paternal action, which may provide unique opportunities to learn different kinds of skills that are important for children's intellectual and social competence. And what are those kinds of unique talents that dads bring to the parenting enterprise? There are a bunch of them, but I'm going to just focus on economics, play, sort of general orientation towards one's kids that dads take in terms of being more challenging, and then discipline as well. So the first point to make here is about providership. And I think, in this day and age, we become less likely to focus on the economic role that dads play in the lives of their kids. But it's still obviously the case that, putting a roof over your child's head, putting food on their table, and either living in the right neighborhood or giving your kids tutoring through the economic resources that you can bring into the home are all important ways in which dads serve the welfare of their kids. And it's still the case that in the average American married home, that dads take the lead when it comes to providing financially for their kids. In fact, I found that married dads make about 69% of family income today. So still a pretty important share of what's happening economically in most American families. It's also the case, too, that when you think about what's driving men's participation in the labor force, it's important to note that both they themselves and their wives prefer that they're more likely to do full-time work. And the modal preference for married mothers today is to work part-time. So there's a division of labor there that corresponds typically to what both the fathers and the mothers would prefer for their own family and work arrangement. So, if you walk into a park, whether you're here in New York City or in Charlottesville where I live, or at least much of North America, I think what you'll find oftentimes is that they're both moms and dads in that park. But I think in most cases what you'll see is that dads are more likely to be engaged in behavior like that father, in the pool, throwing their toddlers up into the air to their squeals of delight, and often to sort of big eyes from mom if she's in the picture as well. And this kind of behavior is typical of the way in which dads interact with their infants, toddlers, and kids as they kind of move through the life course. Dads are more likely to engage in rough play with their kids. They're more likely to surprise and excite their children. And kids are more likely to be stimulated by their father, but also to learn how to deal with kind of the physicality of their world when they're interacting with their father. So psychologist John Snary at Emory has found, in terms of looking at this issue of dads roughhousing with their kids, say on a Saturday morning or on a Thursday night before bedtime, that kids who roughhouse with their fathers quickly learn that biting, kicking, and other forms of physical violence are not acceptable. Unquote. Okay. So what's clear from all this is that kids enjoy being physically aroused by their dads, and they also learn how to control their own bodies in the physical play that they do with their dads. And what's also interesting in all this, based upon some work that Ross Park has done, is that kids who physically play more with their fathers are more likely to be popular in school and to navigate the social realities of school more successfully. And if you have kids who are in school, or if you have younger siblings who are in school, or if you can even recollect your own experience in school, you can think about the ways in which, for instance, being able to control your body at recess and control the way in which you relate to other kids physically at recess might be connected to, for instance, roughhousing in ways that would make this kind of finding from Ross Park comprehensible. But the bigger point that I'm making here is that play matters, and that Dad's distinctive approach to play seems to benefit their kids in, among other ways, social, kind of social success at school. A third point here, when it comes to this issue of risk, is that in their approach to child rearing, dads are more likely to encourage their children to take risks, to embrace challenges, and to be independent, whereas moms are more likely to focus on their children's safety and emotional well-being. Quote, fathers play a particularly important role in the development of children's openness to the world, writes the Canadian psychologist Daniel Paquette. Quote, they also tend to encourage children to take risks, while at the same time ensuring the latter's safety and security, thus permitting children to learn to be braver in unfamiliar situations, as well as to stand up for themselves, unquote. And Paquette, in his work on this question of dad's role and sort of basically pushing, in more simple terms, pushing kids out of the nest, has found that dads are more likely to introduce their sons and daughters to the worlds of work, sports, and civil society, and more generally to encourage their kids to embrace novel activities and to be independent. And one small study is sort of from France, actually, is illustrative of what's happening here. And what this study found was that as parents were teaching their toddlers to swim, they found that, quote, fathers tend to stand behind their children so the children are facing their social environment, whereas mothers tend to position themselves in front of their children, seeking to establish visual contact with the children. So in other words, when the dads are in the pool, they're more likely to take the toddler and have the toddler face out, in the pool, whereas the mom is much more likely to have the toddler in the pool facing them. Okay, and these are both important things. If you're a kid, learning how to swim, I'm sure it's good to sort of see your parent right there in your face, sort of protecting you. But if you're going to learn to swim, you also need to be able to face out into that big pool of water and navigate it on your own. So it's just one kind of concrete example of the way in which dads play an important role, in this case in a pool, in challenging their kids to embrace that challenge. Now we all know kind of the old story about dads and discipline, that their strength, their size, the tone of their voice, that these kinds of things can matter for kids and matter for kids' responsiveness to parental discipline. Because dads are bigger and they're more assertive and they're less willing to bend rules for their kids than mothers are typically, they tend to get more obedience, particularly among teenage boys, than do moms. So, in the words of Yale psychiatrist Kyle Pruitt, quote, fathers tend to be more willing than mothers to confront their children and enforce discipline, leaving their children with the impression that they, in fact, have more authority. But I want to also make the point here, too, that kids, and I think in some ways particularly teenagers, benefit from having a father who has this distinctive approach to discipline, but they also benefit from being exposed here to diverse styles of discipline and diverse styles of authority. They benefit both from oftentimes the more nurturing and flexible style of a mother and the more firm and authoritative and rule-based approach of the father. And particularly, I think in this economy and in our schools, you can imagine, being in a nonprofit or being in a school where kind of mom's more flexible style of discipline gives you a kind of template for how to navigate that reality. But you can also imagine here, say in the city, for instance, working maybe down on Mall Street in a more sort of hierarchical, more kind of aggressive, authoritative or authoritarian institution where a kind of paternal style of discipline as a child would help you kind of navigate that world and that reality, or being in the military, for instance. So the point here is that having access to two different styles of discipline gives kids a kind of template that they can use as they move forward today in a variety of social environments. And not surprisingly, kids who grow up with an involved and with an authoritative father, that is a father who is affectionate, consistent in his approach to discipline, but not authoritarian and not permissive, sort of that middle way. Kids with that kind of dad tend to do better in life, both compared to kids who have got lower quality paternal relationships with their dads and kids being raised by single mothers. So boys without engaged fathers, of course, are less likely to be disciplined and monitored. And they're also more likely to fall prey to a kind of compensatory masculinity, marked by more aggression and a more promiscuous approach to sexuality. And among other things, not surprisingly, they're more likely to end up being delinquent, having some kind of violent incident, and ending up in prison by the time they turn 30. So this next slide, which comes from an article I published in The Atlantic last year, gives you a sense of sort of how boys do on a delinquency scale across different kinds of fatherhood/family structure situations. So boys who reported a top third score when it came to their relationship with their father were the least likely to be delinquent here. And boys in sort of an average were also less likely, whereas boys in a low quality relationship with their dad were actually the most delinquent. And then boys in a single mother household were also were more likely to be delinquent. Okay, so the point I'm making here is there's a way in which not just sort of present fathers, but fathers able to forge a strong relationship with their kids are more likely to help their kids, in this case, their boys, steer clear of delinquency. But dads matter for daughters as well. And we see in this research is that girls who don't have engaged fathers are more likely to seek out attention from boys, and more likely, in part, to be sexually active and to become pregnant as teenagers. So not having a dad in the picture to give you affection, to give you attention, and to kind of figure out who's in your social network and who might be a threat, for instance, to you as a teenage girl. When you don't have a dad doing those kinds of things as a teenage girl, you're more likely to end up pregnant as a teen. And here, it's both about family structure and about the quality of the relationship with the dad in a fairly straightforward fashion. So you can see here that girls who have high quality relationships with their dads are the least likely to get pregnant as teenagers, and that the quality of the paternal daughter relationship is, the more risk, and then it's highest in a household where dad's not there at all. Okay, so pretty clear picture here when it comes to establishing empirically. And think about your comments earlier tonight, Claire. I mean, if you were to have kind of come back at these kids with some of these kinds of findings, you might have been able to, obviously in a judicious way, you might have been able to kind of get them thinking about the ways in which not having a dad, is linked to some outcomes either in their own lives or lives of their peers that would make sense in light of this kind of research. And then for both boys and girls who are teens, they're more likely to be flourishing psychologically when they have an active, engaged dad in their lives. So we can see here once again that depression is lowest among kids who report high-quality relationships with their father, and higher both for kids being raised by single moms and kids being raised in homes where they don't have a high-quality relationship with their father. Okay, so I've been arguing that fatherhood is transformative for men, and transformative for kids. And I've also been trying to have us think about the ways in which marriage plays an important role, both for men and for their kids, in making all this happen. So just to kind of recap the ideas here, what I want to suggest to you is when it comes to kids, marriage matters for connecting dads to their children. That's because married dads are more likely to maintain a kind of a day in and day out relationship with their children that helps them to forge good or good enough relationships with their kids. And by contrast, kids whose parents begin their relationship with them, in a sense, by having them in a cohabiting relationship, are much more likely to part ways as the kids move through the life course. And kids who are born either to cohabiting parents or to single mothers are, as a consequence, much less likely to have their kids involved, to have their fathers involved in their lives on a day in and day out basis. So my point is, it's simply, once again, that marriage plays an important role in connecting ordinary men to their kids in a day in, day out kind of way. And when it comes to men, what I'm suggesting tonight is that marriage plays an important role in making men become more responsible. And George Akerlof is an economist at Berkeley and at Brookings. He's won the Nobel Prize. He's a very accomplished scholar in his own right. He also happens to be the husband of Janet Yellen, who's now, of course, the Fed chair. And in 1998, he wrote a very interesting article on men and families. And he said a lot of things in that article that are pretty, I think, insightful. But one thing he said was that, quote, men settle down when they get married. If they fail to get married, they fail to settle down. Okay. And I think that kind of notion today might seem a little antiquarian. Doesn't really apply to 2014, But what I've tried to suggest to you tonight is actually it still applies even today. It's still the case that when men get married and then have kids, once again, they tend to work harder, more strategically, they make more money, they're more likely to attend religious services, they're less likely to attend bars. So his insight here remains valid even in our day. So to conclude here, what I'm suggesting tonight is that given the transformative power of married fatherhood for men and for their kids, we need to renew the economic, the legal, the civic, and the cultural foundations of marriage and fatherhood for our day. That's a tall order, and one which I think this conference is designed to help all of you here prepare and exercise some leadership on. So I encourage you, as you move forward in life, to become leaders on the kinds of issues and questions that will help men get connected to their kids, in part through rebuilding a marriage culture, both here in the United States and around the world. So with that, thank you. Questions are great. Yeah, questions are welcome.
Does anyone have any questions? I have one. I'm wondering, conservatives, definitely a lot in the U.S. talk about the sort of good of marriage and also about the sort of like desire for marriage, the good and true and all that.
Right.
And given like all of these benefits, economic and et cetera, the sort of to being a father and to all of that, what's, like, I know you've outlined sort of huge obstacles to kind of overcome in small ways and in large ways, but like what's, I don't know if there's like one simple answer, but essentially what's accounting for, like if it's so good and there is this kind of innate desire,
yes,
why are we seeing like the reverse on every level in the sense of like, the delay of marriage age by like 3 years every 5 years, and also the sort of increased rates of, cohabiting, which is understandable, but, is it just a matter of a lack of education and awareness, or like, is there something about sort of making marriage cool again? And if it's the latter, that it's sort of a matter of a kind of like popularization of marriage, do you think the gay marriage sort of program of action ties into that at all, in the sense of if marriage becomes a sort of ultimate for all couples, would that have benefits for heterosexuals in terms of, encouraging people to do the marriage thing as opposed to cohabiting?
So why are we in this predicament? I mean, if marriage is so good for men and for their kids, what accounts for this this retreat from marriage that we've seen since the 1970s? There's a lot, obviously, you could talk about, but let me just mention a couple of things that come to mind in terms of accounting for why it is that there is a retreat from marriage, particularly among working class and poor Americans. Not just actually poor Americans and working class Americans, but across much of Europe, actually, and much of Latin America, we now see that marriage trends are pretty stratified. And I think one issue is fear. Another word that comes to mind is sacrifice. A third issue that comes to mind is money. And then a fourth issue that comes to mind is, well, this is actually two words, inflated expectations. Okay, so in terms of the first point, fear, we've just lived through a major divorce revolution in the 1970s and 80s where about half of all first marriages ended in divorce. And many kids saw their parents get divorced, or saw their best friend's parents get divorced, or their uncle and aunt get divorced. And when you see a divorce unfold, in your own arena as a kid, that makes you more hesitant, for obvious reasons, to go ahead and get married. So fear, I think, is one part of this story in terms of the whole fallout of the divorce revolution. The second word is sacrifice. We all know that a lot of goods in life, whether it's physical fitness, whether it's academic accomplishment, whether it's some kind of professional work, require sacrifice. That to achieve these certain goods, you have to sacrifice. The same thing is true for marriage. And I think for a variety of reasons, the kind of sacrifices that marriage entails are less attractive in this milieu today, and they may seem more difficult to make for young adults today than would have been the case for young adults, say, in the 1950s or the 1850s. And you can all probably fill in the blanks there in terms of what that's about. And then in terms of money, and this, frankly, is an area where I think conservatives are not always as attentive as they should be. Today, marriage rates have kind of stabilized among college-educated women, for instance, in the last couple of years. They've stopped dropping. They continue to drop for working class and poor women who don't have college degrees. Why is that? Well, this is not rocket science. The men in their lives have seen their real wages decline since the 1970s, and the rates of unemployment and underemployment go up. And so if you don't have a decent economic foundation upon which to establish your marriage, you're less likely to get married. This is true even before the sexual revolution. This is true in the 1930s. It's true in the 1880s. It's true in Egypt right now. When you don't have a good economic environment for young adults, particularly young adult men, people don't get married typically, or they get married a lot less. So the third point here is that we need to think about ways, from a policy perspective, to increase economic opportunities for particularly less educated men. And there are some things that can be done on that score, I would argue. And the final point, though, is, as Andrew Cherlin has argued in his work, The Marriage Go-Round, a great book, by the way, is that we moved from a cornerstone model of marriage where you kind of got married as a young adult and that you established a life together financially, emotionally, socially, and had kids together, to a capstone model of marriage, where people think you have to achieve a certain level of financial and professional success, and where you have to kind of have just the right kind of emotional, romantic, maybe sexual kind of relationship before you transition into marriage. So you set the bar higher for marriage in ways that make it harder, particularly for working class and poor Americans, to realize that model of marriage. But I think also set the sort of expectations for any marriage, probably higher than they should be. I'm talking about on average. So these are kind of 4 different factors that help us to understand why, marriage is an important social good, and it serves the welfare of most, not all, but most adults, and particularly their kids. But it is, difficult and challenging in certain ways that I think are, particularly noteworthy in this society. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does this data apply to traditional couples only, like being a man and a woman in marriage, or would it technically apply to couples where, because like in my observations, like
yes.
in gay marriage, there's like generally like a dominant person who would be the father figure. So does this apply to those as well, or just to traditional couples?
So she's asking if this this idea that there's some kind of division of labor, perhaps, and some kind of different orientation towards, say, the rearing of kids, is applicable just to heterosexual households as well, or is it also the case it's applicable to same-sex households? And some work done by Ross Park and others suggests that you see some similar dynamics as well in gay and lesbian households, where one partner does operate in a kind of more masculine way and in a more feminine way, even though they are a same-sex partnership. So yeah, that's what some preliminary work suggests. And the question becomes, does a more masculine lesbian function the same way for a child as does a heterosexual father, or does a more feminine gay father function the same way as a more feminine mother would be? And we don't yet really have sort of the scientific answer to that question. Yes?
Yes, to answer your question, in addition, I think that one fact that would be very hard to ignore, certainly in my own research, is that we live in a culture that is profoundly changed, and I would even say dominated in some ways, by feminism. I mean, that's a cultural environment that is very pervasive. And although feminists differ, I mean, the messages from different kinds of feminism don't always cohere, but there certainly is one message that underlies them all, I think, and that is women can do it all, and should do it all. And if they have to have husbands, that's so much the better for some feminists. Other feminists wouldn't want even that. But I mean, that's going to be very, very hard to challenge and change.
We like to provide that sort of entry point, like for men, sort of say what's, yeah.
Well, even to argue in a newspaper editorial that there's some reason why we need to take fathers seriously, in spite of all the derogatory things that are going on in connection with fathers. Even to do that, you have to go against the grain. So there's an inherent disadvantage at this point in arguing this, even though I mean, I agree with everything. It all makes perfect sense. But to say that, to say what is common sense today is very difficult. And then I guess another factor would be to the extent that traditional forms of religion are no longer as prevalent as they once were. I mean, that was another institution that strongly supported marriage.
Reed?
Is there any evidence or data or any way of finding, on the economic question, to what degree are men seeing a marriage premium because their employers are either giving them the job because they've taken on the responsibility of fatherhood, or are, instead of paying the fathers according to their labor, paying them according to their need? Is there anybody doing any research on that, and is that even possible?
There is work being done on that. There was a piece in the New York Times, Upshot, by I think Claire Miller on that score, or that issue in part. And there does seem to be some evidence to suggest that once again, even today, that employers tend to, and maybe in a more even unconscious way, rather than a conscious way, maybe tend to pay married fathers more money, but also kind of look at them as better candidates for particular jobs than their unmarried peers. So one thing that a progressive would say in response to what I said tonight in part is that, well, one reason that married fathers tend to do better in the workplace is that they're still kind of privileged in some kind of way. A different way to look at that would be to say that there's something about employers wanting to help married dads do well, or just thinking that they are generally more responsible and therefore probably worth keeping and paying more.
Yeah. Well, for the sake of the young leaders here, I'd love, if you don't mind, to tell one short anecdote. It's happened with 2 jobs, but my first job out of college, my interviewer, who was the person that hired me, said, "You're not the most qualified for the job, but I'm going to give it to you." And I was shocked. I said, "Well, thank you." Why?
Yeah.
He said, "Because you've already gotten married, you already have a child. So this isn't a theoretical job for beer money. This is a real job that you actually need." And then he said, "And so you're going to come on time. You're going to come every day. You're not going to skip work. You're not going to embezzle from the company. You're not going to." And I made a mental note of all the things I wasn't going to do. I didn't realize what I was signing up for because he'd given me a serious job. And it was amazing how that vote of confidence on the employer's part kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy for me to do really well in that job.
Right.
So it was, and I wasn't paid more per hour because I was married, but got the job because it gave him the confidence that I was a serious employee.
Right. And for one of the things I do in my class is in the middle of class, I will call State Farm and ask them to give me a quote for a 24-year-old guy with, I don't know, say a Honda Accord 2010, who's married, and then that same guy who is single. And there's a pretty dramatic difference in the insurance quote that I'll get for the married 24-year-old guy and the single 24-year-old guy. And it's just designed to sort of suggest to my class that getting married does change the way in which people and institutions treat you, particularly if you're a man. So that's just one other sort of concrete example of how that plays out in the marketplace. Yes, sir.
So many of these things that are said here, they're really good, but they're based on a concept of something of the common good, social good. But people nowadays don't really have much of a sense of the common good. And so how would you present this in such a way that people would be open to considering these things when they don't have a conception of the common good?
Well, I think it's right that, two things. I would actually push back a little bit on that, and I think people are sort of looking for a notion of a good life at some level. Oftentimes, they may not always, express that or explicitly acknowledge it. But I think one of the problems with our day is that we don't actually lift the bar higher for folks and kind of paint a vision that's connected to a vision of the common good. So I think it's worth mentioning arguments that speak to the common good to try to inspire and motivate people in part. But it's also, I think, the case, too, that a lot of these arguments actually are about kind of like what Tocqueville would call enlightened self-interest. That there are obviously ways in which, if you're a guy, generally speaking, if you get and stay married, you're going to do better financially. And the same thing is true for women in terms of if they have kids. And if you want the best for your kids, they're going to do better on average if you get and stay married as well. So there's a kind of enlightened self-interest kind of argument that you can, I think, pose with regards to these, with regards to sort of points about, in this case, fatherhood and marriage that are worth that are worth making. But I would also say, and this is more, like Reed might come down on this more later on, but it's also important to sort of situate all this in the context of certain narratives, certain stories or certain ideals that are attractive in other ways. These kinds of arguments have a certain kind of utility, but I think ultimately people are more likely to be persuaded by stories, by dreams, and by ideals that among other things, motivate them to make the sacrifices that are required to be good husbands, good fathers, and for women to marry someone and to help him become a good husband and a good father. Yes, sir.
Now, for all these statistics that you showed that included examples of fathers with children, do you know how much it affects that sort of data depending on how many children the father has? Does it make a big difference whether the father has 1 or 5 kids?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, my suspicion is that more kids would lead to, on average, more work, for instance. But that's been my experience personally.
That's a safe bet.
But I haven't seen anything empirically on that issue exactly. That's my intuition. So, yes, in the far back.
I recently saw a news report where married men with children indeed get the highest salaries, and that the second would be followed by married women, and third would be single men, and last would be married women with children. And
You mean unmarried women? You said married men with kids, married women with kids, or you're saying married women without kids was the second most?
without kids.
Yes, okay,
And
right.
then the last is married with kids, women married with kids. And
Yeah.
on your point on fatherhood
Right.
premium, and I don't know if I wanted to push back on that idea, because don't you think that the premium is partly driven by the need to compensate for women who are married with children being at the very bottom of the economic structure?
Well, no, I mean, you're right in a certain way that part of what's happening here is that married dads are picking up an additional burden because married moms are less connected to the labor force than their female peers who don't have kids. So there's a certain kind of division of labor that's happening there that's designed to make sure that the family has a certain level of income as the mom tends to work less in the wake of having kids. So it doesn't in that case, it doesn't really redound to his benefit per se in that case, but it does redound to the financial benefit of the family typically in that case. And the other thing, though, to note is that there's some new work done by Jane Waldfogel up at Columbia University here in New York that is finding that there's a motherhood penalty for women, but that motherhood penalty is now lower among married moms compared to single moms. And part of the theory here is that in today's world, where men are doing more, so in the 70s, for instance, men spent about 1 hour doing childcare and the like, compared to 4 hours on the part of their wives. So basically 4-to-1 ratio. Whereas since the 1990s, it's come down to about 2-to-1. It's been stable pretty much since then. So women still do more around the household and with their kids. But in the U.S., men have stepped up their game and are devoting more hours to their kids and to the care of the home. And so that probably is one reason why women who are mothers actually experience a lower motherhood penalty when it comes to their own work if they're married compared to being a single mother. So what I'm saying to you is that married dads are kind of stepping up in large part because it's still the case that married moms are not going to do as much on average economically. But even from kind of the woman's perspective, even from kind of a more progressive perspective, there's still something to say about marriage that benefits not just the family as a whole financially, but also sort of women's capacity, if they so desire, to plug into the labor force and also be a mom. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Paul?
But where are the hours coming from? Because you're saying that married fathers who live at home are working more hours. Not that there's a correlation there. But
Right.
you're also saying that there's a correlation between these men and spending more time with their children. So I'm confused about that.
Where are the hours coming from men? Is that your question?
Yeah.
They're coming from evenings at the bar with friends and from, watching lots of TV and, I'm being a little bit facetious here, what I'm suggesting to you is that in the wake of having, kids, if you're married, men are stepping up in the workplace, but they're also kind of stepping away from other things that would take away from their family life.
But the reason I asked is because one of the chief complaints of children of my generation has been that their fathers spent too much time not in the bars, but at work.
Right.
I mean, that was a major complaint.
Right.
And now you're saying that they're spending more time at work, but it's a good thing. So I'm confused here.
Well, I think, that's a good question. I mean, I think my sense is that up to a point, like moving from, say, 35 or even 40 hours a week to 45 or 50 might be financially beneficial for families, as dads become more focused on their work and providing. But if that went up to 70 or 80 hours a week, that would become more problematic. But I don't think we're seeing on average that kind of dramatic increase in work in the wake of becoming a dad. And what I'm also saying too is that both moms and dads, even in spite of the fact that moms are spending more time in the paid labor force, today spend more time with their kids on a one-on-one basis than they did in the 1960s and 50s when some of us were being raised, or the 70s. And that's because both men and women have cut back, and this is not always a good thing in its entirety, but they've cut back on leisure, they've also cut back on housework, and other things that would impinge on either their work or their capacity to spend time with their kids.
Wrap up with that. So I want to thank Brad, and we have